Welcome to the introductory episode of Sidebar, a podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations with a focus on white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielson.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, as well as partners with Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, board of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigations, and enforcement actions.
All right, thanks, Matthew. And today, for our inaugural kickoff podcast, we are thrilled to have with us our Policy Resolution Group colleague, Josh Zive, who's also a podcaster like us and also a lawyer like us. Josh is one of the founding podcasters of the Bracewell podcast empire at the Lobby Shop. And Josh is kindly going to chat with us today about what he sees and what Matthew and I see as developments in the Department of Justice and the SEC with President Biden's first 100 days, and with what we may expect to see going forward with investigations and enforcement out of the Biden administration.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks very much for having me on today. Really appreciate it. I will note, I appreciate the kind words, but the two groups that I think are easiest to get into right now and carry the least public esteem might be podcaster and lawyer. So I'll take that for what it's worth. But I'm really glad that you're doing this project. You and Matt are both doing this project. As you might know, there's no shortage of podcasts overall, but there's a really, I think, disappointing lack of podcasts that have much substantive meat to them, things that people can listen to in ways that can really inform the business decisions they might have to make or the legal decisions. And so I know that's why we jumped into it with the Lobby Shop, was to try to help people who were, dealing with issues at that intersection between policymaking in Washington and kind of the general counsel's office and the government affairs offices at companies all around the country and the globe, and kind of how you could get a view into that. That's why we did what we did. So I'm really interested to learn more about what you guys are up to. So for those of us who are, because you said I'm a lawyer, but let's be clear. I don't do trial law. I am, to many of you lawyers, I am what is considered a fake lawyer, I believe is the term that you often will use lovingly for it. But
just in private.
Now we
just call you that behind your back.
We just get all. This is the thing about the podcast. It's really just a form of very public, troubling therapy, Matt. So we just bring it all out. We put it all out there in the front. So we're going to deal with these cleavages in our organization right now between the fake lawyers and the real lawyers. You're going to help make me a real lawyer over the course of this podcast. And that means understanding what the sidebar is and what you guys are going to talk about. So why don't we just start right off the top? What is Sidebar? Explain that to me, someone who's not a government investigations or a government enforcement lawyer in a strict sense. What is Sidebar and why did you guys start doing it?
Well, one of the things that really jumped out for us over the last few months is that we were getting lots of questions about having kind of a dramatic change in the world of what's going on in DC in terms of prosecutions and investigations and enforcement. And is it predictable? Is it going to move slowly? Are all of a sudden anyone who's involved in the financial services industry, anyone who's doing business abroad, are they going to be investigated constantly, or are things going to, more or less be the same? 4 years ago, and for, almost the entirety of the 8-year administration prior to 4 years ago, the SEC employed this practice that it referred to as broken windows, which involved more minutia-based technical regulatory inquiries and investigations about small things, in addition to big things, but small things that proved to be pretty time-consuming and pretty expensive and kind of a drag on lots of things that may have happened or the things people wanted to do in the financial services world. And then that went away. So now things have changed, and there's a new administration with new people in leadership positions at the Department of Justice, at the SEC, at other regulators that touch lots of different businesses. And the question is, now what?
Yeah, I was going to say towards that end, for people like out here, we see names, right? We know Merrick Garland is now, Judge Merrick Garland is now the Attorney General of the United States. We know we have a new head of the SEC. But for most of us, it's just a name and a title, right? There's not a clear sense of either who that person is or why that's important. So if those folks are important, maybe you could, like, what is it? Who are the, explain to me why those positions, the changes there are meaningful, or maybe what we should take of note of the new people running those organizations.
By the way, the real answer why we're doing this podcast is Phil and I lost a bet. So,
well, that's fair. That's fair. That's a better bet than I lost my fantasy league and I have to take the SAT next year.
Are you going to study for it?
No. Me and my co-manager. That was the loser of the league. The deal was you had to take the SAT and you had to share your scores with everyone in the fantasy league.
That's a fantastic bet.
When we came up with it, we all agreed it was a brilliant punishment. Right?
Except everyone's going to think that you're clearly in there for some Varsity Blues scam. I'm 16 and I'm a sophomore.
Be like, no, I'm a debate team ringer. All right, sorry guys. Let's go back to Matt. The question was what to make of the new leadership at the DOJ and the SEC.
They're really just a representative of the administration, as you know. I mean, they're there to really carry out the policies and viewpoints of the Biden administration. And so I think kind of we can get into what we expect out of both of those agencies and others. But I think the bottom line is we expect there to be increased enforcement activity, which is, usually consistent with a Democratic administration.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at some of what now Attorney General Garland said during his confirmation process, I mean, he listed off all sorts of things that are just mirror things that President Biden and Vice President Harris and others on their teams have been saying really for months about things that they think merit additional attention. Things like, civil rights, things like the environment, things like corruption, things like COVID, PPP fraud. And some of these things did get attention over the last, 18 months or so, but I think you can count on them getting more attention. And actually, Josh, one thing you may know more about now than I do, I saw a couple weeks ago, I think that the president was proposing something like a $1 or $2 billion extra budget amount for DOJ. I don't know if that's gotten any legs, but I mean, if you want an indicator that an administration wants to spend, wants DOJ to do more, giving it nearly $2 billion extra seems like a good indicator that you want more out of DOJ.
Yeah, well, actually, just today, the Attorney General was up on Capitol Hill testifying before the Appropriations Committees, asking for all that money and laying it out. And he laid out a bunch of big buckets of new money that they're planning on spending. Draw particular attention to focusing on things like domestic extremism and domestic terrorism, and they're asking for a bunch of new money for prosecutors on that work.
So this is exactly Lobby Shop and Sidebar coming together.
This is right. It's a Reese's peanut butter cup type moment, and we're going to enjoy it thoroughly.
I'm just glad to be back on a Lobby Shop podcast. I was a guest a couple of years ago. Did you know that, Phil?
I did know that. I mean, I've listened to that episode probably 5 or 6 times.
You, in fact, are the only person who has listened to it. I think it was a good sign. It was released like at 11 p.m. on like July 29th. It was like a Thursday. Big crowd, big podcast crowd there. Josh, I mean, getting to your point, though, is that, under the SEC, under the Trump administration, I mean, there for a while, they just didn't have funds to hire anyone. And There's a lot of attrition there. So we saw a tremendous amount of decrease in activity. While the numbers, show otherwise, quite frankly, there was kind of some sweeps there and they got some kind of low hanging fruit and kind of boosted up the enforcement numbers. But you have the constraints of the purse kind of being let out. And that's going to be one of the reasons why we're going to see just necessarily more activities. There's going to be more people working in those agencies to have more to do.
So they got a big buckets of money lying around. You got a new administration that wants to pursue their priorities. So, I mean, it seems like you guys are going to have a lot of stuff to talk about on Sidebar. Why don't we, what are some of the, I mean, I don't want you guys to, look, we don't have time. I mean, I know we could go into all of these issues for hours because they're entirely complex, but why don't we touch on what you think some of the major issues are that are going to be driving both Sidebar and this administration's over the next few months? Like, what are some of the topics that you think they're going to take this money and focus on that people out there, companies and other folks should be aware of?
One of the things that I know we're going to talk about in the weeks ahead that's gotten a lot of attention recently is this ESG stuff, which
what's that stand for, Phil?
That stands for environment, social, and governance, which is sort of corporate governance.
Tricked you. Used an acronym and you didn't know exactly what it meant.
Environment, social, governance, but also corporate governance. Yes, that is right. That is right.
Well, let me ask you again. What's that stand for, Phil?
Environment, social, governance.
Okay, great. And what are those
social
issues?
Governance. So, and that's something that the SEC is talking about a lot right now. They've put together a dedicated task force to focus on that. And I think the SEC's view really takes sort of two perspectives on ESG stuff. One, it's how public companies disclose their approach to ESG issues, because companies are now disclosing more and more about it for various reasons. And separately, what sort of investment advisors, financial services firms are doing with respect to investment decisions in ESG entities. One of the things that is kind of amazing that's emerged over the last year or so is major institutional investors, totally separate from any government requirement, government expectation, are saying that, they want to dedicate certain amounts of their funds or withhold certain funds from potential investment targets based on those companies, not strictly financial performance metrics, but because of other things that the companies do. So having a major, institutional investor saying, we're only going to invest in companies that have a good idea or plan for what they want to do about climate change. Well, all of a sudden you have a major stakeholder in the markets dictating terms for what it wants to see that are totally separate from regulation, totally separate from statute or anything else. And that's a development, and it's interesting. And it's something that now regulators are taking a pretty close look at. And there are others looking at it too. I mean, from litigation perspectives and the like. But I think that's something that we're going to talk about and dig into a little bit more. We're going to talk about some cybersecurity issues because we've had some very large and notable data breaches over the last few months that are getting a lot of attention. And we're going to talk about some things that are more basic, but are just coming up and are noteworthy. Things like what happens when there is a government investigation and the FBI shows up at someone's doorstep and has a search warrant and wants to execute a search warrant.
Well, I mean, Phil, as the outside general counsel to the FBI Agents Association, the answer is that you prepare them a delicious breakfast and you let them in, right? That's
absolutely. But you don't tell them anything other than perhaps what the breakfast is, and don't use the breakfast as an excuse to distract them while you're going to shred stuff.
That's good advice. That's why we turn to experts in.
Now, Phil, it's amazing how you've kind of foresaw these topics we might talk about. I mean, it's as if perhaps this isn't the first time we're recording an episode.
What is it? Prior planning prevents poor performance.
Precisely.
That's what this is.
I'll also note we might be doing a podcast on congressional investigations.
Yeah, I did want to make sure we touched on that. So, Matt, because now that you've mentioned it, because I mean that's a little bit closer to the world that the folks here at the lobby shop kind of often have to worry about, which is when policymakers start meddling around and turning the Klieg lights onto the private sector. So what do you keeping your eye on in that world of government investigations?
I think it's going to be along the lines of what Phil actually said. ESG is really, I hate to admit that, ESG really is just kind of this fascinating area. It's the first time where I think I've done compliance work for a company that was really pushed by the shareholders. I mean, that's why, clients have come and they're updating their policies on these issues, especially social issues, which, aren't normally what we would see in the compliance world.
So when you guys let me understand. So when you guys are talking about this, I guess, are you guys going to help? You'll probably help people better understand kind of both the way the status of the law is and kind of practically how to respond to it. Just to try to understand a little bit kind of what your approach to this is. If I'm a company, why should I listen to this?
Well, because I think it's developing, right? And I think you will hear discussions of what is ESG. Well, I don't know if we know yet because is developing. The SEC is trying to figure out, for instance, how do we make companies disclose things that are outside of financial performance? Because that's some of what we're talking about, right? They need to disclose the impact of climate change on their financials. But our paradigm here isn't to make companies disclose their impact on society, like, for instance, you see more in Europe. So there's just kind of this paradigm shift that's kind of going on. And I think that's why you're going to see congressional hearings and investigations relating to ESG, cyber attacks. Those are certainly going to continue. And we're seeing those including by state-sponsored activists such as Russia, who President Biden recently sanctioned as a result of the attacks that were discovered last year, or at least publicized last year.
Well, I can't wait to be able to listen to this. I know we've got clients all across the board. These are the sorts of things they ask us about all the time. What's coming? How do I get ready? And it's good to know we've got people kind of on the ground keeping an eye on it. So, I mean, you guys tell me, if I want to find Sidebar, where can I find it? Because, some people call things podcasts, but they just keep them on these weird little websites and no one can find them. Where can people go to find Sidebar?
Well, you can certainly find it through our webpage at www.bracewell.com. You can also find it on Spotify, iCloud, Apple Podcasts, the little podcast button on your iPhone when you press it, and there's a search window and you just type in the thing you're looking for and the name of the podcast comes up. I think you can find it there and anywhere else that you get your podcasts.
I regret to inform people, based upon my experience, that your parents cannot listen to the podcast simply by yelling your name at their phones. That's the one method that does not work, I've discovered. Or selecting you from a contact list and thinking that it pulls up the podcast. None of those options will work. But all of your podcast platforms will have you. I can't wait to listen to it. Hey, Phil, Matt, thank you so much for making the time to let me, just kind of your average witted, fake lawyer, wander in and pick your brains for a little bit. We're definitely going to have you guys on the lobby shop. I hope maybe if sometime we can, if we put on our barrister's attire and sufficiently fake you, maybe we can find our way onto Sidebar at some point in the future.
We'd love to have you. If you have a wig or a robe or something like that, it may help you sneak past the folks who vet our guests. It'll help you blend in.
A whole separate podcast feed to go into my collection of wigs and robes.
Well, the good news is we've reduced our application fee for being a guest.
That's good. Hey, guys, thank you so much for letting me come visit you today, and I really can't wait to hear what you guys have to offer on Sidebar.
Thanks, Josh. We appreciate it, and we always look forward to hearing what you and your PRG buddies are doing on the lobby shop.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.